Hello again and happy Monday. We're going to read our next installment of Wayside School is Falling Down by Sachar. We're going to read chapter 19, which is called A Bad Case of the Sillies. Now, pay close attention to the chapters as they come out the next few chapters. Also, remember that Wayside School was built sideways. There are 30 stories. They were supposed to be 1 story high, 30 stories all in a row, but the architect turned the blueprint sideways accidentally and built it 1 classroom in a row and 30 stories high. But he forgot the 19th story, so there is no 19th story. So in Sideways Stories from Wayside School, there actually wasn't a 19th story. It just said that. We do know that Mrs. Arves teaches class on the 19th story, but there is no Mrs. Arves. So some things all get tied together here in this next chapter. So chapter 19, A Bad Case of the Sillies. Allison started up the stairs 5 minutes before the bell rang for school to start. The stairs were completely empty. Allison liked it that way. When the bell rang, the stairs would be crammed with thousands of screaming kids scurrying to their rooms. But now it was nice and peaceful. She walked up past the 18th story and toward the 20th. There was no 19th story in Wayside School. Mrs. Arves taught class on the 19th story, and there was no Mrs. Arves. Allison didn't understand it. If there was no 19th story, then why wasn't her class really the 29th? Suddenly she heard footsteps charging up behind her. She turned around to see Ron and Dee Dee racing. She leaned against the wall to get out of their way, but Dee Dee stamped on her foot and Ron's elbow jammed her in the stomach. Oof, she grunted as she fell and rolled down 3 steps. Ron and Dee Dee didn't even stop to say they were sorry. Allison slowly stood up. Fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but her windbreaker was torn. She thought Ron and Dee Dee were silly. They race all the way up the stairs, then they get to Mrs. Jewell's room, and they're too pooped to learn anything. Allison thought the kids in Mrs. Jewell's class were silly, even Rondi, and Rondi was her best friend. Then there was Jason, who was always pestering her. That was because Jason hated her, or else he loved her. Allison wasn't sure. When she got to class, Dee Dee and Ron were sitting with their heads flat on their desks and their tongues hanging out. "You could have said you were sorry," Allison said as she walked past them. She sat straight up in her chair. She folded her hands on her desk and waited as everyone else wandered in. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside it. "Look what I brought," he said. "What's the name of your goldfish?" asked Mrs. Jewells. "Shark," said Jason. Everybody laughed. Allison rolled her eyes. "It makes him feel important," Jason exclaimed. "Where should I put him?" "How about on the top shelf of the coat closet?" suggested Mrs. Jewells. Jason had to stand on a chair on his tiptoes. He held the bowl at the very bottom and tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Suddenly, the chair toppled over. "Ah!" yelled Jason as he fell to the floor. He was holding the bowl upside down above his wet face. Mrs. Jewells hurried to the back of the room. "Quick! Somebody fill the bowl with water," she said. "Where's Shark?" Jason made a face. "I swallowed him." The class went crazy. What a show-off, thought Allison. Mrs. Jewells rang her cowbell and told everyone to settle down. "You have a bad case of the sillies this morning," she said. She took roll. "Who's absent?" she asked. "Allison," said Rondi. "Very funny, Rondi," said Allison. "Anybody besides Allison?" said Mrs. Jewells. "I'm here, Mrs. Jewells," said Allison. She sat behind Eric Fry, so she thought Mrs. Jewells couldn't see her. Eric Fry was the biggest kid in class. "Just Allison," said Mrs. Jewells. She marked it on her green roll card. "Damien, will you please take the roll card to the office?" Allison stood up. "I'm not absent," she said. Damien took the roll card and walked out the door. "Mrs. Jewells, did you mark me absent?" she asked. Mrs. Jewells didn't answer her. Allison marched to her desk. "Mrs. Jewells, did you mark me absent?" she asked again. Mrs. Jewells looked up. "Terrence, what are you whispering about?" "Nothing," mumbled Terrence. "If you can say it to Jenny, you can say it to me," said Mrs. Jewells. "Get off my case, buzzard face," said Terrence. "Terrence!" exclaimed Mrs. Jewells. "Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline." But that's what I said to Jenny, Terrence protested. Mrs. Jules, what about me? Allison demanded. Mrs. Jules ignored her. Allison screamed as loud as she could. Mrs. Jules didn't hear her. Allison faced the class. Can't anybody see me? She asked. Nobody answered her. Rondi? Shouted Allison. Dana? Jason? This isn't funny, said Allison. I know you're all just pretending. She stood right in front of Jason, leaned over the desk, and stared straight into his eyes. I know you can see me, she said. You're trying not to laugh. He stared right through her. She stuck out her tongue at him. He leaned forward, causing Allison's tongue to lick his nose. Yuck, she exclaimed, and wiped her tongue on her sleeve. Mrs. Jules began the morning lesson. Have you gone crazy? Shouted Allison. She ran out of the room and down to the class on the 29th story. Come quick, she said. There's something wrong with Mrs. Jules' class. No one heard her. She slammed the door and continued down the stairs to the 28th floor. No one saw her there either. Tears streamed down her face. Is the whole school playing a joke on me? She wondered. It's not funny. She shouted as loud as she could. She continued down the stairs, screaming anything that came to her head, hoping that someone would hear her or notice her. Fish for sale, fresh fish, fat fish, get your fresh fat fish. A tall, skinny lady with very short hair stepped out of the one classroom. Shh, she whispered. This is a school, not a fish market. You can hear me? Asked Allison. She was so happy she wanted to hug her. Yes, I can hear you, the woman said sternly. My whole class can hear you. You're making it impossible for us to get any work done. I'm sorry, said Allison, but something's wrong with Mrs. Jules' class. You'd better come in here, said the teacher. Allison followed the teacher into her classroom. What's your name? Asked the teacher. Allison. Boys and girls, this is Allison, the teacher announced to her students. She'll be joining our class. What? said Allison. But my name is Mrs. Arves, said the teacher. Welcome to the 19th story. And that's where we'll break for now at still chapter 19, A Wonderful Teacher. So you'll notice that now that Allison is in the 19th story, she's stuck there. So we're on chapter 19 for 2 in a row. All right, thanks. See you back for the next chapter.